Hi, my name is Sarah Castillo, and this is my narrative speech for my Introduction to Speech Communication course. How many of you all are grateful for the challenges your grandparents or parents have faced in order to provide you and your siblings a better life? I'm sure most of you would answer yes, just like me. I'm about to give you all a synopsis of my grandfather's life story and how he was able to become an American citizen. My grandfather's life has been filled with hardship since an early age. When he was 4 years old, he lost his mother while she was giving birth to his younger brother. Unfortunately, his younger brother ended up passing away a few days later as well due to complications. He was then left under his father's care for the next few years, until his father passed away when he was 11 years old due to cancer. He found himself orphaned at 11 years old with nowhere to go. So he was sent to live with 3 aunts in Nuevo Laredo, who were the sisters of his late father. In Nuevo Laredo, my grandfather didn't have much. He lived a very humble life and often sometimes went without meals. I recall him telling me that he couldn't afford shoes, and when the only thing that he could afford was straw, so he would make his own huaraches. It was either that or go barefoot. And I remember that profoundly because, I've always had clothes. I've always had all these different things that my grandfather went without when he was my age. So like I said, he was very poor and he was unable to afford much, and he subsequently ended up dropping out of high school because he didn't have enough money to continue his education. When he was 19 years old, he decided that he needed to change his course of life. So he decided to enlist in the army to become an American citizen. He completed his training when he was 20 years old, and the next year he was sent off to Germany to fight the Nazi regime in World War II. My grandfather, when he was sent over to Germany, he experienced great culture shock, and he enjoyed the fact that he was in a different surrounding and that he was meeting different people from all walks of life. And that kind of sparked the travel bug in my grandfather. So once the war ended, he returned to the United States as an American citizen. And he traveled all across the U.S. visiting his army buddies who lived in the Northeast and Midwest. So he found himself in those new regions that he had never visited before. And he worked odd jobs, in factories, just trying to make ends meet and sending money home to his 3 tias. And my grandfather felt it was his responsibility to care for them and to financially be there for them since they were there for him when he was orphaned. And he found himself visiting Nuevo Laredo very often, and he met my grandmother in Nuevo Laredo one day, and he fell in love with her at first sight. So as a newlywed, he moved my grandmother and him to Chicago, where my mother and 2 of her siblings were born. They lived in where the Italian community lived. They discriminated a lot against Hispanics and Latinos. So the only reason he was able to live in the Italian neighborhood is because he passed off my grandmother as Italian, even though she was Hispanic, because she was very light complected. So once in Chicago, he raised my mother and her two other siblings until my grandmother asked my grandfather to move back to Nuevo Laredo because her father was falling ill and she wanted to be closer to her dad. So my grandfather relocated to Laredo and bought a home for him and his small family. And he left my grandmother here while he continued working in Chicago, and he would come back and forth between Illinois and Chicago. And my grandfather, because of his hard work, he put my mom and her siblings through school, and all of them were able to become college graduates. So I really admire my grandfather for the heroic efforts that they seem heroic to me, for the effort that he put in instilling that an education is important for anybody to succeed, and he really wanted his children to remember that. I'm here to share with you all that I'm here to pay homage to my grandfather and his struggle to achieve a more prosperous life. And I see him as a hero for everything that he did for my mother and her siblings. My grandfather lived here in Laredo, retired here and lived here in Laredo until he passed away in 2011. And if there's anything that my grandfather would want you all to take from his story, from his life story, is that you should not let your hardships define you. And you can always persevere and always make it through, no matter the circumstances. You have to deal, no matter the cards you're dealt, you can get where you want to be. You have to make the most of it. And sometimes I find myself struggling to continue on, and I find myself being weighed down by, I find myself being weighed down by unfortunate circumstances, and it kind of seems like walls are caving in around me. But then I remember my grandfather and how he was always able to overcome everything, and it gives me motivation and it gives me the hope I need in order to continue. Thank you all very much.